In our last lecture, we were looking at producer behavior and started looking at cost benefit analysis. And we looked at the benefits of adding inputs. Now we have to look at costs. Now, you should have learned in macro there's a cost that it's very important to economists, and that's opportunity cost. That's what you have to give up in order to get something else. Now, when we break opportunity costs up, we break them up into two categories. Explicit cost, and that's a cost that you have to make a monetary payment for, or an implicit cost. And an implicit cost is where no monetary payment is made. It costs you something other than money. For example, taking this class. There's an implicit cost and an explicit cost. Well, obviously, the explicit cost of taking the class is the tuition you have to pay. But there's an implicit cost also. That's time with your friends or what you would have been doing otherwise. Okay, so we have those type of costs that we look at. But there's some other costs that are very important in business that we need to take a look at. Here's some of the other costs that we look at. Obviously, we first look at, our total cost. What does it cost us in total to produce so many units of a good? Now, our total cost is made up of two other costs. That is a variable cost and a fixed cost. A variable cost is a cost that changes as input changes. Right? So this is something that you can change. All right? Variable costs are due to variable inputs. A variable input is an input whose amount you can change. Right? So you can change labor. Labor is the classic example of a variable input. You can change it because you can walk in one day if you're the boss and just fire everybody. Okay, you have no more labor left. Right? So variable inputs can change, and we find them changing in both the long run and the short run. Now, a fixed cost is a cost that you can't change. And that has associated with it a fixed input. And a fixed input is an input that you can't change. For example, in our previous lecture, we talked about Old MacDonald's farm. Old MacDonald had a variable input of fertilizer. She could change the amount of fertilizer she had, but she had a fixed input that was land. She couldn't change the amount of land she had. If she had 10 acres, she had 10 acres. And she had to pay those 10 acres whether she farmed them or not. All right. Now, previously we had talked about long run and short run, and now we have to adjust their definitions slightly. The short run is a time period less than a year, and it's a time period in which you have at least one fixed input. There's something you can't change. The long run, on the other hand, is now going to be defined as a time period, a year or more, in which all inputs are variable. Very big distinction here. In the long run, all of our inputs are variable. In the short run, we have fixed and variable inputs. That becomes extremely important because in the short run, we can't make all the adjustments we would like. Old MacDonald could not sell all of her land, or could not sell part of her land. But whether she farmed it or not, she still had to pay the cost of it. So that's a real important thing. Keep that in mind. It's going to come back to haunt us in a little while. All right. So when we're looking at costs, we see that our total cost is made up of our variable cost plus our fixed cost. All right. There's some other costs that we also have to look at. These are marginal cost and sunken cost. Now, marginal cost, again, the word marginal, you should be thinking the word additional. Marginal cost is the additional cost of adding an additional input. If I add one more unit of an output, how's that going to change my cost? If I make one more television, what does it cost me to make that one additional television? So again, it's change in total cost divided by change in output. Now, one other cost, not very one we talk about a lot or even calculate, but it's something you need to keep in mind. That's a sunken cost. A sunken cost is a cost which a firm commits itself to for a given period of time and you can't change. Sunken costs come about because of things like contracts or depreciation of machinery. For you and I, it may be the lease on our car. We have it for a given period of time. We can't change it. We can't get out of it. We have to go. Okay? Now, with all these definitions of costs, I would like you to get a calculator and to look at this chart. What I'd like you to do in a moment is to pause this presentation here and take a moment to fill in the columns, the variable cost, the total cost, the average total cost, your average variable, average fixed, and your marginal costs. Calculate them. I've given you the formulas on how to do them. Calculate them and then come back. I hope you did indeed take a moment to calculate these costs. Here they are. Here are the answers to the chart you just looked at. It's important that you kind of understand where these numbers are coming from because we're going to be using these concepts going forward. So I hope you take a moment to look over these numbers and check them with the numbers that you calculated. Now, if you didn't calculate them, you may want to write these numbers down because in our next slide, we're going to have to start doing graphing. I'm going to be graphing these numbers. Now, what I'd like you to do, again, is to pause the slide for a moment and graph your average total cost, your average variable cost, your average fixed cost, and your marginal cost. What you're going to be doing is you're going to be putting the costs on the vertical axis and output along the horizontal axis, right? So at first, you're going to be measuring average total cost here. So at the first, which is 10 units, your average total cost is 2.5. The next is, I think, 25 units. And you keep doing that. All right. Do all of the average total costs, connect the dots, label that average total cost. All right. Then measure now average variable cost up here, which is at 10 units, I think it's 0.5, and then you do that. Keep doing it until you have all four. The next slide will show you what they are to look like. All right. Hopefully you paused the slide and you drew your curves. Now you're going to get something that looks like this. This is slightly off as far as the graphs are concerned, especially here for your average total cost. If we had more data, this average total cost curve would start to go up. All right. You don't have all those numbers, so you're not seeing it. What you should have drawn, and I'm hoping you've drawn these, is this. What you'd also see is not only does your average total cost curve go up, but your average variable cost curve goes up. Now, if we look at a more general look at these curves, you would get something that looked like this. Now, let's take a step back a moment. Let's get rid of these curves, let them fly out, and let's leave the average total cost curve. It usually takes a U shape, and it drops and then it increases because it is reacting to what's happening to average fixed cost and average variable cost. So let's put those in. Here's our average fixed cost. Our average fixed cost is always a downward sloping curve. Why? Well, remember how we calculated average fixed cost. It was calculated by taking your fixed cost, a fixed number, dividing it by more output. That means you're taking a set number, dividing it by more numbers, the quotient keeps getting smaller. If we look at our average variable cost, it starts low and begins to jump. Why? It jumps because as we add more output, the cost of adding that output is greater than the additional cost. All right. The cost of adding it is greater than the output we get. All right. And finally, our marginal cost curve. Take a look at this marginal cost curve. It takes this kind of J shape or Nike swoosh or whatever you want to call it. Get used to seeing that because this is going to be a very important curve for us. We're going to be drawing a lot of it. So please make sure you understand what that looks like. These are all short run curves. How do you know these are short run curves? Well, right here. You've got a fixed cost here. So this average total cost has to be a short run average total cost because it's taking into account this average fixed cost. All right. As we go forward over the next couple of lectures, when we start looking at market structures, being able to look at graphs and being able to interpret what they're telling you becomes incredibly important. And one of the things graphs should be able to tell you in most cases is whether this is a long run picture or a short run picture. And as we get into market structures, I'll try to emphasize how you can tell the difference between a long run and a short run. For right now, noticing you have a fixed cost in there automatically, since you know fixed costs can only occur in the short run, this has to be a short run picture. This has to be a short run average total cost curve. Now, I'm running out of time in this lecture, so we're going to go to another lecture. It's the Producer Behavior Lecture 3, and it's going to be a short one, but we're going to talk about the difference between long run average total cost curves and short run average total cost curves. So let's shut this one down and go to Lecture 3.